Imagine an engine that defies the laws of physics. No spark plugs, no glow plugs, and a compression ratio, a mere fraction of what should be required. By all modern understanding, this machine should not run. Yet, it has run for over a century, outliving its more celebrated contemporaries. The real revelation, however, isn't just its incredible resilience, but how its brilliant British origin was almost entirely forgotten. To understand how this enduring machine came to be, we must go back to its origins, which begin in an unexpected place. A modest workshop in Britain, with one stubborn man pursuing an idea that seemed like a step backward to everyone around him. The very existence of this engine is rooted in a fundamental problem of the 1880s. If you wanted to power anything with an internal combustion engine, be it a pumping station, a mill, or a threshing machine on a remote farm, your fuel options were surprisingly dangerous. Coal gas required piping, rendering it useless off-grid. Volatile petroleum spirits, though effective, posed a hazard that nobody fully understood or respected. They evaporated, pooled, and easily found a flame. Storing a barrel of such fuel near a running engine, in an era before the risks were comprehended, was an open invitation to a catastrophic fire. Yet, at the bottom of the barrel lay the fuel everyone truly desired. Heavy oil, paraffin, crude, the thick residual grades. These were cheap, abundant, and far more difficult to accidentally ignite. That very quality, however, was also the precise problem. Heavy oil wouldn't light easily inside a cylinder, and the two most apparent methods to force ignition were both dead ends in the 1880s. The first method involved an electrical spark. Heavy oil burns with a lot of soot, and within minutes, carbon deposits would coat the electrodes, creating a conductive film that shorted the gap and extinguished the spark entirely. This was a fouling that the fragile electrical systems of the era simply could not overcome. The second method was brute compression, squeezing the fuel until the heat generated by the compression alone ignited it. However, the engines and the robust metals capable of withstanding such extreme pressures did not yet exist. Into this challenging landscape stepped Herbert Akroyd Stewart. He was neither famous nor wealthy, an engineer working from his father's tin plate works at Fenny Stratford in Buckinghamshire. Stewart possessed a methodical, obstinate mind, one that would fixate on a single problem and refuse to be swayed. What fixated him on this particular problem was, of all things, an accident. One day, around 1885, at the works, paraffin spilled into a pot of molten tin. It instantly flashed into vapor, caught fire from a nearby lamp, and ignited. This could have easily been dismissed as a minor incident, a spill, a scare, a quick cleanup. Instead, Stewart perceived something in it that almost no one else would have. The paraffin hadn't required a direct flame to ignite as a liquid. It had vaporized and ignited the very instant it touched a sufficiently hot surface, the molten tin itself. Heavy oil, the very fuel everyone claimed couldn't be ignited on demand, would light on contact with hot metal. When I first learned of this origin, I had to pause, because the entire concept of the engine was encapsulated within that workshop accident involving a pot of tin. Everything that followed, the development of a machine that would eventually reach the Arctic and thousands of harbors worldwide, was essentially Stewart figuring out how to replicate that accidental ignition, intentionally and rhythmically. By 1886, Stewart had a working prototype. It was crude, but it accomplished what textbooks declared impossible. He constructed a chamber, a cast-iron bulb, bolted onto the cylinder head, and heated it externally with a blow lamp before starting the engine. When heavy oil was sprayed into this already glowing chamber, it ignited on contact, precisely as the paraffin had on the molten tin. There was no spark plug to foul with soot, no electrical gap to short, and none of the extreme compression that rival designs were pursuing. Instead, it relied on a modest squeeze, a glowing iron chamber, and heavy oil's inherent willingness to ignite the moment it touched hot metal. In 1890, Stewart filed the crucial patent, number 7146, jointly with an engineer named Charles Richard Binney. Its verbose Victorian title described improvements in engines operated by the explosion of mixtures of combustible vapor or gas and air. Buried within that dry legalistic language was a machine that defied the very rules the rest of the industry was still establishing. A patent, however, is merely a piece of paper. What transforms paper into a working engine requires capital, courage, and someone willing to risk public failure. That someone was Richard Hornsby. Hornsby ran an established agricultural engineering firm in Grantham, Lincolnshire, renowned for producing respectable, proven farm machinery. It was precisely the kind of business least expected to gamble on an unproven contraption from an outside inventor. But Hornsby recognized its potential. He acquired the license, committing his firm's name, reputation, and factory floor to a design that many in the trade considered backward. If Stewart provided the intellect, Hornsby supplied the brawn and the risk. Without him, the hot bulb engine would have remained a clever drawing in a patent file, nothing more. In June 1891, Stewart and Hornsby presented their invention to those who would ultimately determine its fate, not scientists, but farmers. At the Royal Agricultural Show in Doncaster, Hornsby exhibited two of the engines. This was the pivotal moment the idea left the workshop and met the practical men who might actually purchase it, hard-headed agricultural buyers who cared nothing for theoretical elegance, but everything for whether a machine would start on a cold morning and continue running all season. Imagine the scene at the close of that show. One inventor in Buckinghamshire, one manufacturer in a Lincolnshire market town, and a single, peculiar machine, preheated by a blow lamp, which every rival engineer in Britain would have dismissed as a dead end, now poised to face its first real-world test. To truly understand its success, one must grasp the elegant trick at its core. The hot bulb doesn't remain hot because of the blow lamp. The lamp is merely for starting. Once the engine is running, each firing stroke transfers its own intense heat into the walls of that iron chamber. This stored heat is precisely what ignites the subsequent charge of fuel. The bulb glows because it just fired, and it fires because it is glowing. It's a continuous cycle. The engine, quite literally, operates on the memory of its own previous cycle. Cease feeding it fuel, and that memory fades. The iron cools, and within minutes, the machine forgets how to run and falls silent. It's crucial to understand the nature of these first Hornsby Akroyd machines, as this detail becomes immensely important later. They were four-stroke engines equipped with proper mechanical valves, a camshaft, and the full orthodox arrangement of the era: intake, compression, power, and exhaust, all in strict sequence, governed by hardened steel and precise timing. Rugged, certainly. Heavy and filled with numerous moving parts, also true. Remember this, because a lighter, more ingenious version of this concept is on its way, and the distinction between them will determine who receives credit. The brilliance of the hot bulb engine lay in its specifications. It typically operated with a compression ratio between 3:1 and 5:1. In contrast, the compression ignition engines that would soon be hailed as the modern standard ran at 15:1, even 22:1, 3, 4, or 5 times as much. On paper, the hot bulb appeared hopelessly, laughably undercompressed. In practice, however, that very gentleness was its greatest asset. Lower pressures translated to lower stresses, allowing for an engine that could be built robustly, simply, and almost indestructibly, with ordinary tools in any basic workshop. Furthermore, it could burn almost any fuel: crude oil straight from the ground, paraffin, vegetable oil, and even, on fishing boats when nothing else was available, fish oil. You didn't start it with a starter motor. Often there wasn't one. Instead, you warmed the bulb with a blow lamp for several minutes, then turned the engine over, sometimes by heaving on the flywheel, sometimes with a charge of compressed air. It demanded patience, not electricity. Picture the daily ritual on a small fishing vessel. Before dawn, the skipper would crouch over the engine in the dim light, the blow lamp roaring against the bulb, watching for the iron to achieve that dull red glow signifying readiness. He judged that color by eye, much like a blacksmith gauges heat without a gauge or dial. Then, he'd swing the flywheel, and if he'd read the metal correctly, the first heavy thump would land, bringing the boat to life beneath his feet. Get it wrong, and the engine would sulk, forcing him to restart the entire patient process. There was a unique craft to simply owning one of these engines, a daily competence that the men who operated them wore with quiet pride. Yet that memory in the iron also had a temper, and managing it was where the romance of the engineering met the reality of the man standing beside it. Imagine a sawmill on a winter afternoon. The engine is thumping along at its steady, unhurried beat, the bulb maintaining an even glow. Then, the blade bites into a hidden knot in the timber, and the load surges. The engine works harder, burns hotter, and the bulb begins to run away with itself, glowing more fiercely than it should. Now, the fuel ignites too early, before the piston has fully risen to meet it, and the machine starts to fight its own rhythm. You hear it before you see it, a harsh, violent hammering, disrupting the smooth thump, knocking, pre-ignition. Left unchecked, that hammering would batter an engine to pieces. The solution was water, a controlled drip fed into the system to cool the bulb and retard the timing. On the simplest, cheapest models, this drip was truly a manual affair, involving a small valve and a man who had learned to open it a touch more when the load surged, and ease it back as things settled. It was about managing the beat by ear, much like learning the breathing of someone asleep beside you. However, it would be incorrect to suggest that the entire range relied solely on human intuition. The more substantial industrial engines incorporated governors and load water systems that automatically metered the cooling as the load fluctuated, allowing the engine to largely manage itself. The hand on the valve represented the humble end of the spectrum. The more sophisticated versions had already begun to automate the very instinct that made these engines feel so alive. The engine possessed one more distinctive characteristic worth noting. Under a light load, it didn't need to fire on every cycle to maintain its rotation. Its governor simply allowed it to skip. It would fire once, then coast on the flywheel's momentum for 1, 2, or even 3 strokes, before firing again once the speed had diminished. This hit-and-miss operation is precisely why its beat under light load was so slow, so distinctly syncopated. Remember that. This irregular, unhurried thump will prove more significant than any statistic in this entire narrative. Simple, safe, rugged, and inexpensive to run, Hornsby was successfully selling these engines across the world throughout the early and mid-1890s. While the rest of the industry was still debating the merits of spark ignition, the men who could interpret that dull red glow by sight, who recognized a well-running engine by its beat in the dark, are nearly all gone now. Much of their practical knowledge was never formally recorded. Yet, that unlikely success continued to spread globally. Meanwhile, in Germany, a different man was nearing a distinct solution to the same problem, and history had already earmarked whose name it would remember. Rudolf Diesel wouldn't successfully run an engine until February 1897, and his first commercial installation didn't follow until March 1898. By then, Stewart and Hornsby had a substantial 5 to 6 year head start, with hundreds and soon thousands of their engines already in operation. Yet this lead would not be enough, and oddly, it wouldn't be Diesel who ultimately usurped their prize. This is where geography becomes critical, and where I must correct a version of the story that is often misremembered, even within Britain itself. The engine was invented in Buckinghamshire, at the very same tin plate works in Fenny Stratford, where the pot of tin had caught fire. It was then built at scale 160 kilometers north in Grantham, Lincolnshire, at Hornsby's works. Invention in one town, manufacture in another. 2 places, 2 men, 1 machine. A small perfect irony is embedded in this geographical split. When the first commercial engines, numbers 101 and 102, rolled off the Grantham line in May 1892, where do you think they were sent? Back towards Buckinghamshire, to the Great Brickhill Waterworks at Fenny Stratford, a mere stone's throw from where Stewart had conceived the device, to pump water. The very birthplace of the invention received its inaugural machines. Remember one crucial detail, as it speaks volumes about the engine's character. Those 2 units operated at that waterworks until 1923. That's 31 years of continuous service. Installed when Queen Victoria was on the throne, still turning long after the First World War had concluded. This was no fortunate prototype. It was a design that was inherently right from the very beginning. There was also a road not taken. In 1892, an engineer named T. H. Barton, working within Hornsby's own factory, advanced the concept towards pure compression ignition, increasing the compression until the fuel ignited solely from the heat of the squeeze, eliminating the need for an external bulb. Stewart himself even patented refinements in this same direction. However, Hornsby chose not to make the high compression path his primary focus. For sound reasons at the time, the low compression hot bulb was the rugged, forgiving choice, perfectly suited to the metallurgical limitations of the 1890s. The higher compression route, conversely, demanded materials and precision that the era could not yet reliably provide. It was a defensible decision for 1892. Keep this in mind, though, because the landscape for that decision was about to shift, and Hornsby would not shift with it. At scale, the Grantham gamble paid off handsomely. Between 1891 and 1905, the works produced 32,417 of these engines. Over 32,000 machines, born from one accidental fire in a tin plate shed and one stubborn man's refusal to ignite his fuel the way everyone else insisted it must be lit. Imagine walking into that Grantham works at its peak, and the place would overwhelm every sense simultaneously. The smell would hit first: hot iron, cutting oil, the sharp tang of the foundry, and the distinct paraffin scent of engines being run up and tested. The sound would be a symphony of lathes, the ringing of hammers on castings, punctuated every so often by the deep, deliberate thump of a finished engine fired for the first time, proving itself before being crated. Rows of cast iron cylinders and flywheels would stand waiting, gray, heavy, and honestly machined by men who could discern a precision of 0.025 millimeters with just a thumbnail. This was ordinary Lincolnshire industry, unhurried, unglamorous, yet quietly constructing the machine that was about to spread to every working coastline on Earth. So this machine was British to its core, invented in Britain, patented in Britain, financed in Britain, proven in Britain, and built by the tens of thousands in Britain, which is precisely why what happened next is so difficult to accept. The design spread to Germany, to the United States, and, most significantly, to Sweden. The easy narrative, the one I initially gravitated towards, suggests that the Swedes simply borrowed a British idea and put their own name on it. But that isn't what occurred. They earned it. The firm central to this development was J&CG Bolinders of Stockholm, founded in 1845 by brothers Jean and Carl Gerhard Bolinder. Both men were long deceased by the time the decisive shift took place. This was the company they left behind, not the brothers themselves. Around 1902, a Swedish engineer named Rundloff devised a way to combine the hot bulb principle with the two-stroke cycle and presented this design to Bolinder. The same combination was independently developed in America by immigrant engineers Meets and Weiss. Bolinder did not invent the two-stroke hot bulb. What Bolinder did was grasp its true purpose and then build it better and in far greater quantities than anyone else on Earth. And the two-stroke cycle utterly transformed everything. It fired on every revolution instead of every other one, allowing for the elimination of the entire four-stroke apparatus: the puppet valves, push rods, camshaft, and timing gear. Roughly half the moving parts were gone. The engine became smaller, lighter, and more economical for the power it produced, with far fewer internal components to wear out or break on a boat 200 meters from the nearest mechanic. It also gained a capability the valved four-stroke never possessed. With no fixed valve timing to adhere to, a skilled hand could stall it and then catch it firing the other way, effectively running the crankshaft backward. No gearbox was needed for a stern movement. The engine simply chose to beat in reverse. Add total loss lubrication, where oil is fed in and burned rather than recirculated through a sump that could fail, and you had the marine engine the sea had been waiting for: tiny, tough, reversible, and forgiving for a fisherman who served as his own mechanic. What most people don't realize, and I certainly didn't until I delved into it, is that Britain wasn't robbed of this invention. Britain lost it through fair engineering competition. Hornsby continued to refine the heavy, valved four-stroke machine he had started with. Sweden, looking at the same fundamental principle, asked what a working boat truly needed and built precisely that. Consequently, the market shifted towards the superior marine engine. By the 1920s, the Bolinder firm commanded approximately 80% of the world market for these engines. 80%. Journey to any harbor, from the Baltic to the Bay of Bengal, listen for that slow thump emanating from a fishing boat, and ask a man what he's running. He wouldn't say Hornsby. He wouldn't say Akroyd Stewart. He wouldn't say Grantham. He would say a Bolinder, and tell you it was a Swedish engine with the certainty of a man stating the obvious. Entire coastal economies were rebuilt around that engine. A fishing family that had toiled under sail for generations could suddenly leave harbor whenever they chose, rather than being dictated by the wind, reach previously inaccessible fishing grounds, and return home against a foul tide. The Bolinder two-stroke didn't just win market share, it fundamentally changed how thousands of ordinary men made their living from the sea. and every one of them learned to call the machine that enabled this Swedish. Britain invented it in a Buckinghamshire workshop and built it in a Lincolnshire town. Sweden asked the more challenging question and answered it, and so Sweden's name became synonymous with the device. The engine went out and conquered the entire world, and somewhere between Grantham and the two-stroke design, it lost its own name. If your father or grandfather ever operated a boat with one of these engines, or if you grew up with that distinctive sound and, like so many others, always assumed it was Scandinavian, I would genuinely like to hear your stories in the comments below. By all rights, that should have been the end for the entire breed of hot bulb engines. Rudolf Diesel's compression ignition engine was undeniably more efficient and more powerful for its size. As the 20th century progressed, the metallurgical advancements that had once hindered Barton's high compression efforts finally caught up. By the 1920s, there were no longer any material excuses. In any fair engineering comparison, the true compression engine had triumphed. Yet, the hot bulb refused to disappear, and the reason for its stubborn survival is not what you might expect. It didn't endure because of superior steel. That advantage had gone to its rival. It survived on simple economics in the places the modern world often overlooked. It was cheaper to purchase, cheaper to fuel with the crudest oil available, and simple enough that a man in a remote fishing village or on a farm at the end of a track could maintain it himself. Without needing specialists or complex spare parts, he could improvise repairs. In environments where reliability and cost outweighed efficiency and speed, which encompassed half the working world, the hot bulb steadfastly held its ground. These engines remained in large-scale production well into the 1950s, decades after they were on paper obsolete. The global distribution map of where they ended up tells the entire story of their persistence. They continued to thump away in the bilges of fishing fleets, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, to the coasts of India and the Far East. They powered pumps that lifted water and drained fields. They ran small generators that brought the first electric light to villages the main grid hadn't reached. They drove sawmills, threshing sets, canal boats, and light vessels, the unfashionable, yet essential machinery of a world that still relied on muscle and patience. Wherever the nearest engineer was a week's journey away, and the only fuel was whatever oil could be obtained cheaply, this was the engine that made perfect sense, long after textbooks had declared it dead. Consider a moment on the water closer to home, one that ought to be famous but isn't. In 1911, Cadbury, the chocolate firm in Bournville, introduced two boats into service, Bournville 1 and Bournville 2. These were the first self-powered motor narrowboats in the United Kingdom, each driven by an 11.2 kilowatt Bolinder hot bulb engine. Not large, not fast, just enough steady, dependable thump to move chocolate along the canals under its own power for the very first time. You'll find historical accounts that carelessly refer to these boats as diesels. They were not. They were hot bulb engines, the great-grandchildren of Stewart's glowing iron chamber, quietly performing a job nobody considered remarkable. Yet, the moment that truly illustrates the essence of this engine did not occur on an English canal, nor does it fit neatly into the chronological order I've been presenting. For the greatest challenge ever posed to one of these engines, the story must reach back a few years earlier and a very long way north. In 1903, the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen embarked on a quest that had defeated navigators for 4 centuries, to sail the Northwest Passage, the ice-choked sea route across the roof of North America. He did not choose a grand steamer. Instead, he took the Gjoa, a small, elderly former herring sloop, a working boat with decades already behind her, selected precisely because she was shallow enough to navigate uncharted channels, where a larger ship would surely run aground and perish. And in the belly of that little boat sat a single, small hot bulb motor, neither British nor Swedish. It was a 9.7 kilowatt Danish engine, sold under the name Dan. By 1903, the idea first ignited in that Buckinghamshire workshop had diffused so thoroughly across northern Europe that the machine chosen to attempt the impossible originated from an entirely different country. The invention had outrun its inventor's homeland in every direction. Think about that power figure. 9.7 kilowatts, less than a modern ride-on lawnmower. That was the auxiliary engine Amundsen trusted to help carry him and his men through some of the most treacherous waters on the planet. The sheer scale of the undertaking makes the choice seem almost insane. This was no swift journey. The Gjoa spent the better part of 2 years frozen into a single sheltered anchorage, while Amundsen and 6 companions, 7 men aboard in total, endured the Arctic winters, conducted their scientific readings, and learned survival from the Inuit who lived there. The little engine sat through all of it in the punishing cold, unheated, and unattended for months at a stretch. Anything with more moving parts, anything requiring a specialist or a fragile electrical system, would have been a death sentence. The very crudeness that made the hot bulb unfashionable was the exact quality that ensured its survivability. What consistently strikes me about this story is the sheer audacity of Amundsen's choice and how completely it was vindicated. From 1903 to 1906, across 3 winters locked in the ice, that engine sat in the cold and waited. And when it was called upon, it turned. When the wind failed and the Gjöa needed to crawl through a gap in the ice floes under her own power, the familiar thump that the harbor men of the North knew so well started up at the very top of the world. The grandest, most powerful engines of the day were never asked to perform anything remotely similar. This impossible, undercompressed, backward little machine, the one every rival engineer had dismissed in 1891, carried the first men ever to conquer the Northwest Passage. And now, that slow, deliberate beat reveals its deeper significance, because it was never merely a sound. Recall the hit-and-miss governing, where the engine would skip firing strokes under light load, coasting on its flywheel's momentum between them. This is precisely why the thump, when running lightly, was so slow, so heavy, so uniquely individual. It was the engine's inherent economy made audible. Men would swear they could stand on a quay in the dark and identify an incoming boat solely by the beat of its motor. And they weren't romanticizing. Each engine's skip-and-fire rhythm was subtly different, a unique signature etched in iron and inertia. The seasoned marine operators had one final trick, born of that same 2-stroke simplicity. To go astern, they would allow the engine to slow almost to a stop, then, catching the flywheel's momentum on the final dying stroke, flick it into firing the other way, reversing the entire boat with nothing but timing, a keen ear, and the sheer weight of a spinning iron wheel. We often assume that newer inherently means better. This engine stands as a quiet, powerful argument against that notion. It possesses a memory, running on the heat of its own last firing. It has a heartbeat by which you could identify a boat. It has a temperament that once demanded a human touch. It is as close as a machine can be to being alive. We invented it, and then we stood still, polishing the heavy first draft, while another country asked what the world genuinely needed and built that instead. So find one of these where it still lives. A small boat in a cold northern harbor, an old engine warming under a blow lamp. Close your eyes. Hear the hiss against the iron, then the first heavy thump, and the second, and that slow, skipping beat settling into a rhythm. Smell the paraffin and the hot metal. Picture the men in a Buckinghamshire workshop and a Lincolnshire foundry who built it and sent it out to pump water and cross the ice. Then open your eyes. The world calls it a Swedish engine. We lit the spark, and then we allowed it to become someone else's story. If stories of a 9.7 kilowatt engine conquering the top of the world intrigue you, subscribe and stay with the channel for more narratives of forgotten ingenuity.